My wife is accused of witchcraft.
Okay, but what does it all mean? Was it really because some people were jealous of the rich dyes produced in Edna and Tim's clothing? I don't think that's actually very likely. So that's the focus of my story today. We're going to be talking about the crimes of Edna Rose of the Frost Coven. Element Void. Zodiac Pisces. Born February 29th, 1258. Age 30. Blood type A. Edna is a witch and serves as the apothecary, or doctor, in Alden. She's married to Timothy Rose. But Edna wasn't born in Scotland. Unlike most of the other citizens in Alden, the Rose family are the only English natives, and they fled their home in London after Edna was accused by their neighbors of bewitching several of their neighbors' husbands. But did she really? In episode 1, Tim actually says,
Whatever she does do with herbs and flowers is one thing, but the things they actually accused her of are not in Edna's power or character.
So whatever Edna does with herbs and flowers didn't really seem to play into it too much. This is because, in many ways, homeopathic remedies were some of the only medicine of the time. Remember, germ theory wasn't written until the 1800s, so we're a full 500 years before people knew of the existence of bacteria. Because of that, people like Edna were seen as a commodity. And now, witches still weren't tolerated by the English Church. The Frost Coven maintained their business quietly in many aspects of London life, from curating curiosities, apothecary, fortune-telling, and a variety of jobs and outlets that obfuscated their pagan rituals from church authorities. If you take a look at the colors Edna used to wear in England, it's very different from her extravagant black attire. And I do mean extravagant. In the 1300s, black clothing was seen as a luxury. Edna's skill with potions and magic allows not only for the rich color development of her black dye, but also many different deliberate shades. And that's why I ended up having to do some color mapping for her outfit. But right now, I'm navigating one of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to cel-shaded work. This gray area is meant to come across as black on items where that's necessary. Think of a lot of manga or comic books in general. That's what this was meant to mimic. If I'm clever, I can use the regular tones of Edna's dress, and then instead of using a burn tool or painting, I'll erase from the line art itself to make the shading. So what did Edna do? Or rather, what did she not do? Back in June, when I was researching different colors of smoke for the Mirari project, I came upon the mention of lysergic acid. For anyone who doesn't know, lysergic acid is what's used to make the street drug known as LSD. It's a highly dangerous substance, and you're about to learn why. This chemical comes from the spores of a certain kind of fungus called ergot. This is a fungus that mostly grows on types of grains from oats, wheat, rye, the list goes on. It's a black, conical fungus that, if missed, can contaminate an entire supply of flour with lysergic acid. And now what happens when you ingest this? Well, at first you're not likely to notice anything. It's flavorless and odorless, especially once it's ground, mixed, and baked into bread. This chemical causes vivid, disturbing hallucinations that may aggravate underlying mental health concerns like depression or trauma, cause a person to want to self-harm, panic, and increase risk-taking or paranoia. I state explicitly that the ADF recognizes there is no safe dosage of LSD, even in the modern era. So think about it. What might a hallucinogenic state feel like to someone in the early to mid-medieval era? Likely like demons, spirits, or witches are controlling their bodies. The effects of ergot fungus ground into bread and eaten unknowingly would cause people to have a deadly reaction to the same effects of LSD. This was also one of the most common explanations of bewitchment at the time. But we know intentionally poisoning someone isn't in Edna's character, right? So I'm going to set the stage for you. It's the late 1290s, and recently there has been a surge of people reporting strange hallucinations or being stalked by devils. Homeopathic medicine is sought in an attempt to soothe those who are already going terminal. And this is where apothecaries like Edna would be called in. It's likely the Frost Coven had already deduced that this was due to a food contamination. When Edna works with patients, she recognizes it specifically as ergot poisoning. Eager to save their husbands, several women cry out to Edna, "What can we do to save them?" But Edna's advice is grim. Pray for them, if you will. Because she could do nothing for them. Nothing in her remedy bag would fix something like ergot poisoning. It was such a problem back in the medieval era that tens of thousands of people died. It even took a heavy toll on the Holy Roman Empire when a case of ergot poisoning swept through their ranks. Spiteful and heartbroken, these women turned on Edna, who had given them the news they just couldn't handle. They felt that ergot poisoning meant witchcraft, and worse, bewitchment, and that somehow Edna has done this on purpose just to see them suffer. Edna fled and hid with her Aunt Prudence, who immediately sent word to gather Tim and Madeline. The family remained with the Frost Coven while Tim attempted to petition the king. However, the family grew impatient and worried. An acquaintance of Edna's, Henry Dawes, was a pastor in a local temple. The man practiced witchcraft the same as the Frost family, but his connections to the church would not be enough to help the Rose family avoid persecution. In advocating for Edna, Henry Dawes was forced to reveal his own talent for spellcasting and was quickly arrested, never to be heard from again. Then one day, to make up for the contamination of bread with ergot poisoning, an influx arrived from Scotland, delivered by a man named Ashley Campbell. This led Edna to inquire about the name, and found the source to be from a small village just west of Glasgow called Alden. Ashley told them that if they faced any further persecution in London, they would be safe at Alden. So the Frost Coven prepared several rituals to protect the family, and then at the start of the warm season, Edna packed her family with very little belongings into a carriage and ran. Now, it's about 400 miles from London to Glasgow. That's almost the same as going from Seattle, Washington to Boise, Idaho, or from Ohio to New York. So that is a long road simply driving by carriage. If you were to walk straight without stopping, it would take just shy of 6 days on foot. Now, that's why it took them almost a month, though. They had to stop and rest. And yeah, it's likely Edna would have been safe even just somewhere other than London. They probably didn't have to go to Scotland, but Edna was personally moved by the kindness of strangers from so far away to share what food they had, so Alden became their final destination. She has a bright spirit, but is very mild-mannered and the strongest magic user in the village. Her name means renewer, delight, and rejuvenation, befitting her role as a healer. She's also heavily inspired by the classic black witchy tropes like Morticia Addams, specifically Angelica Houston, Elvira, and a lot of others. So how does Edna make black dye? Well, black dye was extremely rare to the point of being almost impossible prior to the 12th century Common Era. After the 13th century, when our story starts, it was becoming a lot more regular, but still quite expensive. Related to that, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been out in the woods and seen these strange bulbs that look like little fruit? Well, they might be called oak apples, but don't eat them. These are also called oak galls, and they're actually nests for a specific species of wasp by the same name. I wouldn't worry about them too much. These type of wasps aren't dangerous to humans, and the galls themselves don't hurt the tree. Generally, they'll be harvested after the wasps moved out or died off. Iron sulfate, what was called green vitriol in manuscript, would then be mixed with the galls to form a type of ink that was not only what many of the early medieval books were written with, but also to dye clothing black. Iron sulfate is also what early alchemists used to transmute gold, so what we essentially have is Edna using historical medieval alchemy, embellished with a sprinkling of fantasy. The bluish-black color on her sleeves is probably closer to what black leather looked like at the time, and it was impossible to get a truly black shade with overdying blue, red, yellow, and the ink, but the biggest caveat to that is it would be an expensive process. Although she is, in many ways, a free-thinking woman in her own right, There are still a handful of traditional ways that Edna tries to adhere to when it comes to a woman's role in medieval society. Inevitably, this does cause for some conflict with her daughter Madeline, who is in many ways raised to be one of Scotland rather than England. She doesn't mind that Madeline gets along with Martin and Shane so well, but she tries many times to convince or even discipline Madeline into behaving as a proper lady, much to the young girl's chagrin. Edna and Timothy's dynamic as a couple plays well off of Tim's nature to be understanding and nurturing, but then Edna's ability to further their family in new inventive ways. She isn't just a tailor's wife, nor does she only help him with his business. As we previously said, she is a businesswoman in her own right and runs an apothecary out of the same house as Tim's tailoring. She even came up with a name for her business, Swift Apothecary. It's a tongue-in-cheek reference to the line from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, where after quaffing the potion that would lead to his demise, Romeo says, "Oh, true apothecary, thy drugs are quick." It's probably a little grim considering that she was falsely accused of poisoning several people in London, but honestly, that's just the sort of dark humor that Edna shares with most void element people. In a way, she's taken something that was used against her in the past and turned it into something good that she can be known by. Besides, Romeo and Juliet didn't premiere until 1597, so the connotations of that infamous scene wouldn't be known yet. But for someone like me, living almost 1,000 years after that play is written, I just gotta take a moment and go, wow. Leading into this sort of dark humor is the reason why she's based on things like the Addams. And if you consider how, well, normie Tim is, they come across reminding me of what if Wednesday really did marry that guy she met at summer camp instead of killing him with a jump scare. Now, in England, during the 1300s, witch trials were not really a common occurrence. It wasn't until actually the mid-1400s that we started seeing a uptick in trials and arrests for people accused of being witches. Some examples of these were Eleanor Cobham and Marguerite Jourdain in 1441, which resulted in life imprisonment for the former and execution for heresy for the latter. It was, however, not until the second half of the 16th century that a wide-scale witch hunt took place in England. The cases became more common at the end of the 16th century, the early 17th century, particularly since the succession of James VI and I to the throne. Well, we remember him. He's the guy who actually changed some of the lines in the Bible to include things like homosexuality and the whole "thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." This was, of course, despite the fact that he was giving his own male lovers copious amounts of gifts at the time and power. King James had shown a great interest in the witch trials since the Copenhagen trials in 1589, which had inspired the Northern Berwick witch trials in Scotland. When he succeeded to the English throne in 1603, he sharpened the English Witchcraft Act the following year. However, in England it was not as common as some other nations to be accused of having attended a witch's sabbath or having made a pact with a Satan. The typical victim of the English witch trial was a poor old woman with a bad reputation who was accused by her neighbors of having a familiar and of having injured or caused harm to other people's livestock by use of sorcery. About 500 people were estimated to have been executed for witchcraft in England. Lighting was really fun with this piece. I knew as soon as Shalot gave her a lantern, I'd have to try something a little bit more dynamic. I played with the lighting before in some of my older works. I think that's where I'm at now with how my art is improving. So using some lens flares and things will make really easy and effective light. And then it's just about figuring out where the light actually hits. A good tip for that is try to look at the image from the point of view of the light source. If the light wouldn't see it, then it's in shadow. A dark background to justify the lantern light, and Edna is out searching for something in the dead of night with only a candle lantern to light her way. She's confident, however, because her element of void puts her at home in unseen areas of the world. And gosh, this is my favorite one yet. It's got a real feeling to it of like a Blackbriar album cover or something. But in any case, this is the part where I'm wrapping it up. Hit the like if you haven't already, and please subscribe and ring my bell. Tell me what you thought of the story down below, and be on the lookout for episode 3 coming up soon. If you'd like to support the channel directly, and even have your name read, follow the Patreon link in the description. We have $1, $5, $10, and $50 tiers, each with the unique benefits and bonus content, everything from blank line arts for you to color on your own, the Monomyth comic book, and the Monomyth scripts written in novel format. So thank you to all our current Patreons: Shadow Fox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Morland, and Lunder Lumen.